Welcome to Office Hours. My name is Peter Hannig, and today I want to talk about a pretty obscure, but I would argue very important phenomenon, and that is prison gerrymandering. So, what is prison gerrymandering? Well, first off, let's break down some words. There's no tricks here about prison, right? When I'm talking about prison, I'm talking about prison, exactly what you think it is. But gerrymandering, I think, might need some explanation. So historically, the concept of gerrymandering refers to manipulating the borders or manipulating the boundaries of some kind of political jurisdiction or political district in order to either increase the influence of one group or decrease the influence of another group. So if you've ever looked at like your congressional districts, or if you ever looked at sometimes even city boundaries, you'll see that they don't seem to have a natural or normal shape, right? We think of a community as being relatively contiguous, but some of these congressional districts will be like these weird long squiggles with tails over here and spikes over here, and you're like, what is going on there? And usually the story is that whichever party happens to be in power at the time when the districts are drawn, whether it's the Republicans or the Democrats, what they'll do is to say, oh, how can we maximize our vote and minimize the vote that our opponents get? So every 10 years in the United States, we have the decennial census where we count the number of people who live everywhere. And based upon those counts, we redraw these districts. We redraw these boundaries. And based upon the census, we also apportion representation. So at the national level, we apportion representation based upon it in the House of Representatives, congressional seats, right? Members of the House of Representatives. But at the state level, it might be different states have different kind of legislative bodies, but it might be you might have a Senate and a House like the federal government does, or you could have a different kind of legislative body. But usually there's some amount at which that legislative body is based upon the population of these districts, of however they're drawn. So there's a lot of manipulation and game playing. I'm not going to suggest that all of it is wrong or all of it is illegal. Certainly there's a long tradition in the United States of gerrymandering, going back to this political cartoon from the 19th century, I think, called The Gerrymander, which was looking at some of these districts and the fact that one looked kind of like a salamander, which is where we get this name, gerrymander. But the idea is that there's some kind of manipulation of boundaries and manipulation of counts in order to increase the influence of one group and decrease the influence of another group. And of course, there's this sense that there's something illicit about this, right? There's something that's kind of wrong about this. So what does any of this have to do with prison? And what does any of this have to do, with what does this term prison gerrymandering even mean? Part of this goes back to the history of mass incarceration in the United States, which we usually point to beginning in the late 70s, early 80s, is when you start to see this real spike in the population of prisoners, specifically in state prisons and federal prisons. And it's worth making a distinction here between prisons and jails. For most of the history of the United States, the biggest difference between prisons and jails was that prisons are places where people who are convicted of felonies go, and jails are places where people are convicted of misdemeanors go, right? Or jails are places where people go while they're awaiting trial. A prison, therefore, would be for people who commit who are convicted of these very serious kinds of crimes, right? The types of things that you would get punished for more than 1 year, because ultimately that is, in the United States, generally the distinction between felonies and misdemeanors, right? Felonies, the punishment is more than a year in prison, and misdemeanors, it's less than a year in prison. So I said that that's not entirely true anymore because there are some changes, most notably and kind of most famously here in California, where I live. There's been an effort to shift some of the population where now prisons are reserved for what we might think of as the most serious violent felonies, whereas non-violent felons are moved from prisons to jails. So there's still the kind of this idea of serious crimes versus less serious crimes. But there's another distinction, And the other distinction is that jails are administered at the county level, right? Whereas prisons are administered at the state level. So that doesn't mean that all the prisons are located in the state capital, right? It just means that the state decides where the prisons go. And if you're convicted of a felony and you are sent to prison, there is a good chance that you'll be sent to a prison that is pretty far away from where you live. Whereas if you're convicted of a misdemeanor and you're sent to jail, you're still going to stay within your own county, most likely, right? So that people who are convicted of misdemeanors are still pretty close to the communities in which they live, whereas people who commit felonies are often sent hundreds of miles away. So that's kind of the second part of it. The third part is beginning also in the 1970s, there was this shift, and that is when we started to build prisons, as we built more and more prisons, as we were convicting more and more people of not only misdemeanors but also felonies. This period also is associated with the war on drugs. As more and more people were convicted of drug-related felonies, you had more and more people being sent to prison, so there's a prison building boom in the 1980s and 1990s. Well, one of the things that's happened is that we become more uncomfortable with the idea of punishment, and we don't like to see it, we don't like it around us. The new prisons, when they're built, they tend to be built further and further away from major population centers. And there's also, of course, other good reasons why you might want to build prisons further and further from major population centers. Decreased chance of people escaping and mixing in with the population very easily. Obviously, land is much cheaper as you get further and further away from big cities. So if you want to build a huge prison, it's pretty hard to do if you want to build it in the middle of Los Angeles or Denver or New York City. But it's much easier to do if you want to build it out in a less populated rural area. Okay, so you might have heard this so far and say, what's the upshot here? Well, the upshot is that you also had something else happening during this period, and that is rural areas experienced declines in population as more and more Americans began to move, not just to cities, but also to the suburban areas around cities. So even though in the 1950s and 60s, you have these documented cases of suburbanization, what's sometimes been referred to as white flight, of people leaving urban cities and moving to the suburbs, you still had the metropolitan area, the area around the city, which includes the city and any suburbs, growing, whereas you had these declines in rural areas, in small towns. So maybe you see where this is going. You had this kind of confluence of events. As we're arresting and convicting more and more felons, there's more and more demand for prisons. These more rural areas are losing jobs, experiencing declining populations, so they're desperate for jobs. You need to find a way of keeping people, because if there's no jobs in your area, then guess what's going to happen? All the young people, as soon as they graduate from high school, they're going to move to the city, and that had been happening for decades in the United States. So these small towns, these rural areas needed some way of attracting jobs, keeping jobs, so that they didn't lose population, or else you'd have ghost towns. So we have this nice marriage that occurs in the 1980s and 1990s, where you have states looking to build prisons, and you have rural and small towns looking for jobs, and again, so far, there's not really a problem. The problem is the census, and how we count people, and how we apportion population, and how we distribute power in the United States. In the United States, congressional representation in the House of Representatives is based upon population. It's how many people live in a district. And that's usually also pretty true when it comes to state legislative bodies. It's based upon population, how many people live in a particular area. But it's not just for congressional representation, it's also for things like federal funding, for roads, for hospitals, for schools, for social services. There are so many things tied to population counts. And in the United States, we only really count populations every 10 years. The census does conduct something called the American Community Survey, which is done more frequently. But when we're really talking about these big counts, these important counts that determine things like federal funding and determine things like congressional representation, it's based on the census. So here's the trick. Here's the upshot. Say you have someone who's living in Los Angeles, and they're convicted of a felony, and they're imprisoned. And when they're imprisoned, they're sent. In California, most of the state prisons exist along Highway 99. If you look at a map of California, you see this kind of backbone of prisons going up the interior of the state, far away from these major population centers. So you have someone who's in Los Angeles convicted of a felony and is sent hundreds of miles away to a rural area. Well, when the census comes along, Los Angeles has lost one person. And that rural area where that prison prison is located has gained one person. You have thousands of people being removed from the population in these major cities, which has the effect of weakening congressional representation, weakening legislative representation, decreasing the counts when it comes to things like highways and hospitals and schools and the way funding gets distributed. And you have the populations in these rural areas that were often experiencing real hardship and declining populations and desperate to find ways of holding on to a larger population. Now, what do you see? If you build a prison that holds 1,000 people, you've now increased the number of people who live in that small town by 1,000. So when you see a prison being built in a small town, the construction of the prison will provide employment. The number of people employed as correctional officers certainly will be a source of employment for that town, but it also has the effect of increasing the town's population, or whatever that district is where the prison is located, increasing that population for the purposes of congressional representation, for the purposes of political reapportionment, for the purposes of federal funding. Now, you might think, well, what's the problem, right? You have people living out there. Shouldn't that be where they're living? But that's not the way that we tend to account things like residency generally, right? Anyone if you've ever studied in another state, you know that you have to declare residency in order to get that in-state tuition. And you don't just get it automatically. You have to kind of express a desire to change your residency. It's a voluntary act that you have to demonstrate. But here, you don't even have to intend to do it. It's done automatically for you. Your residency is changed, and now you're no longer a resident of Los Angeles County. You're now going to be a resident of Kern County. So what are the implications of this? Well, there's a couple implications. There's a couple reasons why I think this is a serious issue and worth considering, even if it is pretty obscure. The first is related to what might be referred to as the prison industrial complex. And I know that that's a term that on the one hand is kind of intimidating as a term, and on the other hand has a lot of loaded baggage associated with it. When, if I say prison industrial complex, people say, oh, here comes the lefty again with his crazy conspiracy theories. The phrase goes back to Eisenhower. In his last speech as president of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, decorated Army general, Supreme Allied Commander during World War II. And this is a guy who is as supportive of the military as you could find. But he warned the military has a purpose, and the purpose of the military should be limited. And again, this is someone who has devoted his life to the military. So it's not that he's cynical about the military or jaded about the military or opposed to the military, but he recognized that the purpose of the military was to act in the country's defense, and it must be limited. But when money starts to come into play, and one of the things that he realized watching what had happened to the United States during World War II, the hundreds of millions of dollars spent on weapons and bombs and guns, which, don't get me wrong, money well spent, right? Defeating the Nazis was money well spent. But the amount of money, the sheer amount of money spent, meant that now you had corporations which had a vested interest in increasing that spending and keeping that spending high. You had these corporations who would lobby Congress, these corporations who would influence politicians to keep spending that money. And you'd have the military as any other branch of government, as any other division of any other company, as any other organization. Once they've got a certain amount of funding, they don't want to lose that funding. I don't care whether it's the military or the United Way. Nobody wants their budget to shrink. Everybody wants to hold on to the money. So now the incentives are all in this wrong direction. The incentives are to build as many bombs as possible, as many guns as possible. The military, the incentives are to acquire as many weapons as possible. Maybe, and this was Eisenhower's fear, more than you need. And what do you do? And this is the real concern Eisenhower had. What do you do when you have a military that has a bunch of weapons and a bunch of guns just sitting around? Well, he asked, might we go looking for fights that we don't need to? In the same way, we can say that prisons serve a necessary purpose in the United States. I'm not a prison abolitionist. I know people who are. I would not consider myself a prison abolitionist. I think that there are times and places and certainly types of people who are dangerous and need to be removed from society. Prison has a place. But what do we do when we start associating a profit motive, these incentives to build more prisons? Well, once you've built a prison, you got to fill the prison. Once you've built a prison, you got to find a way of making sure that the prison doesn't shut down. So you got to find ways of getting more and more people in the prison. And this, I'm going to say, certainly is not something that everyone agrees with. So what I'm presenting now is more of a contested view. And the contested view would be when you decrease the representation of the parts of the state where the majority of prisoners are coming from, the cities, and you increase the representation of those areas where the prisons are, their elected officials now have a vested interest in keeping those prisons filled because the citizens of their districts voted for them, and the citizens of their districts are now counting on those prisons as a source of employment, as a source of funds from the federal government, from the state. So the question would be, could there be a prison industrial complex at play here, where now you have legislators maybe passing more severe laws, more severe punishments than would be necessary? Because what you also see happening in the 1980s and 90s is the rise of what are called mandatory minimum sentences, where instead of leaving it up as it had been to the judge to determine the sentence, now more and more you had legislators determining the sentence, saying if you're convicted of this crime, this is the minimum sentence you have to serve, and that minimum was often very high. And the allegation, which again is contested, this was done intentionally. This rise of the war on drugs and the war on crime, the rise of mass incarceration in the 1980s and 90s was not an accident, but it was by design to fill prisons. Okay, so I know that part is contested and not everyone's going to agree with it. It's fine, you don't have to agree with it. But the second part I'm going to say now, I think, is one that is not contested. This is one that is kind of widely accepted. The vast, vast majority of people who are imprisoned, again, by imprisoned we mean someone who's sent away, who's incarcerated for more than 1 year. The vast majority, well over 90% of all people who are incarcerated, who are imprisoned, are going to come home. So we said, oh, the population has changed, and now people are living in the districts where the prisons are located. Well, okay, so when they get out, are they going to stay there? No. Maybe some of them do. The vast majority of people, when they release from prison, they go back to the communities where they came from. And when they go back to the communities where they came from, what do they find? They find that these communities have suffered in a lot of ways. They've suffered not only because of the effects of mass incarceration, not only because of the effects of declining population, specifically of young men, but also because of the declines in population and in political power, and the declines in representation at the congressional level, at the federal level, at the state level, and what's referred to as disinvestment when it comes to schools and hospitals and roads, the kinds of funds that get tied to population. As these areas in cities experience declining populations, as more and more people are sent to prison, they also experience declining investment. And in the United States right now, depending on how you count it, you're looking at about 2 million people who are incarcerated in the United States at the state, federal level, at the local level, in jails and prisons. And the vast majority of those 2 million people come home. We send more people to prison and jail, and they come home. And when they come home, what do they find? They find their communities have often been ravaged by the consequences of mass incarceration. So there's reasons to believe that what we are experiencing now is the ebbing of mass incarceration. For the past 10 years, we've seen declines in the prison population at the state level, at the federal level, declines in the jail population at the county level. It might be that we're looking at the end of mass incarceration. But when we say the end, we don't mean that it's over, we mean that it's declining. There's some estimates that say we won't really exit this period of mass incarceration until about the 2050s or so. But there does seem to be something changing. The pattern of the last 50 years doesn't seem to be the pattern going forward. And so there's this question when it comes to prison gerrymandering of, well, what's going to happen when these prisons start to decline in population? When these small towns, these rural areas, which have come to rely upon prisons as a source of employment and as a source of political power, start to lose that employment and lose that political power. There's a potential for a real crisis, and it's something that's worth paying attention to. So thanks for watching. If you like this video and you'd like to watch more, a bunch of other videos on my page and various topics related to law and crime. If you have a question that you'd like me to cover in office hours, leave a comment below and maybe I'll answer it. Bye.